everyone, I'm Daniela, and this is episode 18 of Historical Paranormal. In this episode, we'll explore the legends of vampires in New Orleans, Louisiana. New Orleans ranks among one of the highest cities for murder rates and is a notorious place for missing persons, especially near the French quarters. Many of New Orleans' urban legends involves vampires, and three of the most notable cases are Count Saint Germain and Jacques Saint Germain, John and Wayne Carter, and the Casket Girls of New Orleans. To understand the story of Jacques Saint Germain, you'd have to go back in time to the 1700s in France, to the tale of a mysterious man who charmed the courts of Europe. His name was Comte de Saint Germain, who was an enigmatic character. He was a prominent member of the high society, a master of the piano and the violin, and could converse in 6 different languages, and his skills as a conversationalist were unrivaled. He was also a composer of music, including arias and solo work for violin. He carried gems around in his clothing, and no one knew how he came into such wealth. No one knew anything about his family, or where he came from, or who he really was. He did, according to some accounts, claim to be the son of Francis II Rákóczi, Prince of Transylvania. One of his great passions was alchemy, and he was believed to have an extraordinary talent for maintaining his youth. Perhaps it was his vast knowledge of cosmetics and herbs that kept him so young. The philosopher Volatile called him the man who knows everything and who never dies. No one really knew his true age. He looked about 40 in all his portraits. Although he was charming, engaging, and graced the dinner tables of many dukes and kings, no one ever saw him eat. He would only sip his wine exquisitely and ramble on about everything from history to chemistry. Comte de Saint Germain had often made bold claims that he was 100 years old and had found an elixir of everlasting life. Many have claimed to have seen him since his death in 1784. Perhaps he wasn't dead, and he reappeared in the 20th century in New Orleans, Louisiana. There was a man by the name of Jacques Saint Germain. His description is similar to Comet. Around 40 years of age and wealthy, he would throw lavish parties and invite the elite, and everyone would sit enraptured in his conversation and food. But Jacques would never eat a morsel, only a sip of wine, nor was he seen in the daylight hours. One night, several months after moving to New Orleans, he invited a prostitute to stay late out on his balcony at the corner of Ursuline and Royal Streets. He grabbed her and tried to bite her neck. She escaped by falling from the balcony and then reported the incident to the police. When the police came to investigate, Jacques Saint Germain had vanished. They searched his apartment and found tablecloths with large splotches of blood on them. They searched the kitchen, where they found no sign of food or evidence that food had ever been there. All they found were bottles of wine, and after pouring themselves a glass, drinking it, and then spitting it out, they discovered that it was not only wine in these bottles, it was wine mixed with human blood. It is unclear whether the Count Saint Germain and Jacques are the same person, but believers speculate they are. Just like Comet, people claim to see Jacques after his death. Another famous case involves John and Wayne Carter. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, these two seemingly normal brothers lived in the French quarters. They both had normal labor jobs down by the river. One day, a girl was reported to have escaped from the Carter brothers' apartment and ran to the authorities. Her wrists were cut, not enough to cause immediate death, but enough to cause her blood to drain slowly over the next several days. The policemen ran to Carter's third-story apartment and found 4 other people tied to chairs with their wrists sliced in the same fashion. Some had been there for many days. The story was that the brothers had abducted these people in order to drink their blood at the end of every day when they came home from work. Police also found about 14 dead bodies. The cops waited for the brothers to return, and when they did, it took 7 or 8 of them to hold down the 2 average-sized men. A few years later, the Carters were finally executed. Their bodies were placed in New Orleans vaults. Cemeteries in New Orleans are quite picturesque. Not only are they more ornate than the rest of the nations, but they enter many generations of one family inside one vault. The remains shifted down the bottom of the vault. When it is all rubble, a new body is slid inside. Many years after the Carter brothers' death, when they were placing another Carter in the family vault, they discovered the vault was completely empty, no John or Wayne. To this day, many sightings have occurred in the French quarters that match the descriptions of these 2 brothers almost exactly. Years later, the owner of the apartment saw 2 figures that matched their description outside of the balcony, whispering to each other. Both figures jumped off the top of the third-story balcony and took off running. The legend goes that if vampires drink your blood 7 nights in a row, then and only then can you become a vampire. One of those, found in the Carter brothers' apartment, had been there for more than 7 days, and would later on go on to become a notorious serial killer, and of course he too would kill victims and was believed to have drunk the blood of all 32 victims. And the Casket Girls of New Orleans. During the colonization of New Orleans, France was having a hard time convincing women to make the voyage. Most of the men who were making the voyage had the reputation of being thieves, murderers, and culprits of every type and caste. Then there was the humid climate and terrain of Louisiana, crawling with alligators and mosquitoes. Eventually, some women were sent. Some sources say that they were nuns, while others say they were prostitutes, but nevertheless a few of them made it. Many of them snuck off the ship in Mobile, Alabama, and when they ported there, were told what type of riffraff they would be tricked into marrying if they stayed on board. Historically, these women were referred to as casket girls, in reference to the small chest in which they carried their clothing and other belongings. However, the legend goes that these girls had the most interesting luggage shaped like little coffins. 300 of these coffin-like suitcases arrived in New Orleans. Some stories say that they were empty, some say they contained the undead. These suitcases were reportedly stored in the attic of a convent in the French Quarter, where they still sit behind windows that are nailed shut because they have a strange habit of just opening by themselves. Years later, in 1978, 2 amateur reporters demanded that the convent's priests let them see the coffins. The priests denied their entrance, so one night these 2 men climbed over a wall with their recording equipment and set up their workstation. The next morning, the reporters' equipment was found strewn about on the street outside, and there on the convent front steps were found the almost decapitated bodies of these 2 men. 80% of the blood was gone. To this day, the unsolved crime baffled investigators. However, historians deny that there ever was the Casket Girls. And recently, there was the claim that 9 people were found in and about the French Quarter area, all having their throats ripped out. Paramedics and other first responders were dumbfounded, as the scene of the crime was gory, but there was no blood. The case resembled an early occurrence in 1933, where 2 known prostitutes met the same demise. A witness that lived above the scene said that he heard screams and he ran to his balcony when he saw a tall, dark figure leaning over the victim. The dark figure was reported to have leapt over a 12-foot wall at the end of the alley and disappeared with no trace. The violence of both of these attacks would have left signs of struggle and the body should have bled out, but they did not. In fact, the bodies in both cases were drained completely. The cases remain unsolved to this day, but locals know the truth. Some common explanations for where these tales of vampires come from in New Orleans is that they're based on clinical vampirism. Clinical vampirism has been recognized as a neurological disease in which those with symptoms drink human blood, believing it to be beneficial to their health. Psychologists have said that symptoms begin with incidents in childhood that draw a sexual connection to the ingestion of blood. This interest in blood results in the individual drinking their own blood and eventually that of other humans or animals. Others say that this is the result of tall tales, like any urban legend passed down over time from the old world to the new world, or is used as a form of mysticism to explain deaths or scare children so they'll go to bed at night or not stay out too late. A more interesting explanation is that these stories of vampires come from fears of infectious diseases in the 19th century. Curator and docent Owen Evers said, the supernatural folklore around vampires was linked to syphilis and tuberculosis, referred to as consumption during that time period. Both diseases were prominent during the 19th century in the South and New England area. For many people struggling with all this bizarre, terrifying sickness, it became a supernatural experience, Evers said. Bram Stoker's Gothic horror novel, Dracula, written near the end of the 19th century, said his description of what the vampire looked like and its effects on the body were taken from direct accounts of how consumption was affecting people, Evers said. Evers said a diagnosis of consumption or tuberculosis was a diagnosis of vampirism back then. In the case of tuberculosis, folkloric methods were used to keep the vampire at bay, like the use of garlic, since the medical community had no reliable course of action. The erotic nocturnal nature of the vampire is also linked to the spread of syphilis. Some of the physical features were derived from congenital syphilis when the disease is transferred during pregnancy. A lot of the way we imagine a vampire has to do with the effects of hereditary syphilis, the elongated fingers, the narrow face, the pointy teeth, Evers said. In the case of syphilis, the primary treatment at the pharmacy was daily mercury injections prior to the discovery of penicillin. Evers said the lack of knowledge of these diseases led to the medical community to often rely on superstitions. While that might be the explanation, there are still some people who claim to be vampires today. John Edgar Browning, a PhD candidate at the Louisiana State University, conducted research in New Orleans that determined that there were about 50 individuals who identified as vampires living in New Orleans alone. Many of the real vampires in New Orleans have fangs or are nocturnal. Research has indicated that these markers are cultural, but the vampires insisted they are biological. Another study by Atlanta Vampire Alliance reported about 5,000 of these individuals live in the United States. However, clinical vampirism, also sometimes called Reinfeld's syndrome, has not been recognized by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Those who self-identify as vampires even have their own organization in New Orleans, known as the New Orleans Vampire Association, or NOVA. The organization accepts all paradigms or denominations of sorts of those who identify as vampires. NOVA is governed by a council which is comprised of members of 7 houses that serve as sects of denominations reflecting various aspects of NOVA's community values. So, whether or not there were ever real vampires stalking the night of New Orleans, or it was a superstitious reaction to a real-world problem, tourists will be drawn to the idea of New Orleans' spooky tales of vampires. I hope that you all enjoyed this week's episode of Historical Paranormal, and if you'd like to check out previous episodes, you can check out the Historical Paranormal playlist, or you can also visit the website and read about it. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for next week's episode.